I think at this point, a lot of people are unaware of the fact that my favorite fighter is Charles Oliveira. When you look at his initial title run against Kevin Lee, Tony Ferguson, Michael Chandler, Poirier, Gaethje, it was nothing short of magical. I mean, the way he used his jiu-jitsu in those matchups was beautiful. But then you fast forward to his prior two fights against Islam Makhachev and Arman Tsarukyan, and I think he represented the sport as a whole terribly. And I'm just being honest. Though I think if you were to ask most people, they would just tell you that the reason why Charles looked so much worse against Arman Islam was just the fact that they were stylistically much more difficult matchups than his prior opponents. But I don't think that on its own is a good explanation. I think Kevin Lee is a very strong wrestler. He dominated Prime Tony on the ground early in that fight. He ragdolled Edson Barbosa pretty similarly to how Khabib did it. So I just don't think that explanation is satisfactory. And I think it has more to do with how Charles chose to use his grappling in those matchups. Because Charles, he put an absolute clinic on Kevin Lee. As soon as it hit the ground, it was just submission attempt after submission attempt, constant transitions, constant attacks, until eventually he guillotined him. So what exactly was the difference between these prior matchups and his more recent ones? Well, I think when you look at a lot of jiu-jitsu guys in MMA, you look at guys like Brian Ortega, Diego Lopes, or maybe even Paul Craig, all of these guys, they just have a very old school style of jiu-jitsu, which is just being way too overly reliant on fighting off of your back in full guard. That is just very, very 30 years ago, or it's modern day Kron Gracie. Regardless, it's old school. Very, very old school. Now, of course, though, those three guys are still so high level from that position that they can make it work. But again, when you're fighting the best of the best at the tip-top highest level of MMA against guys who are ridiculously well-rounded, and you're willing to stay in that area despite having your head pressed into the fence, it's just not a good strategy to have. And that's because, for one, full guard to me, it just has limitations. There's not a ton you can go for from that position. Other than an armbar, triangle, or a Kimura, what can you realistically hit on your opponent from that position? And even with that, how do you impose that on your opponent? How do you force them to get into your guard if they don't want to be there? That's an issue guys like Ortega have dealt with in the past, and frankly, again, it is just not reliable. If you're coming from a jiu-jitsu background, your advantage, it's always going to be in submissions. But like I said, from full guard, there's just not a lot of high percentage things you can hit on an extremely skilled opponent. So what you need to be able to do is transition and move and go to different attacks and keep taking your opponent where you're superior. But from full guard, you're essentially just pinning yourself to the bottom. And the absolute best case scenario for you is your opponent just tries to completely stall and most likely win the round from purely being on top, because they have no reason to want to get up from that position. When you look at jiu-jitsu at the highest level today, which is ADCC, you do not see this old school style that I'm describing. Nobody specializes in full guard. Of course, everybody's proficient in that area, but the meta right now at the highest level of jiu-jitsu is an extremely high emphasis on wrestling and takedowns, really high-level back takes, and leg locks. And when you put those three things together, I think that is the best grappling base you can have. I wholeheartedly believe that jiu-jitsu today is the most well-rounded grappling art in existence, and there's no question there. But if all you watch is MMA, you'd have no idea. If you've wrestled your entire life, the one thing you specialize in is takedowns and pins. If you've done judo your entire life, you specialize in throws, arm bars, and collar chokes, which I guess is unapplicable in MMA. But, if you've trained jiu-jitsu your entire life, you've competed at jiu-jitsu on the highest level, you have to know how to wrestle, you have to know how to fight off your back, and on top, you gotta be able to attack the legs, and you gotta be able to take people's back at an extremely high level. And I think, look, in terms of MMA grappling, that's the full package. But unfortunately, and fortunately, I guess, no high-level jiu-jitsu practitioner today is really transferring over to MMA because, they just don't need to. The money now in jiu-jitsu is so much better than it's ever been before that there's no need to now transfer to a sport where you're making less money and now getting punched in the face. Because, let's be honest, Nicky Rod would wrestle fuck 99.99999% of the UFC heavyweight division. And I don't think there's a question there. But this cannot be said about all jiu-jitsu because the fact of the matter is the wrestling absolutely has to come with it. That is a non-negotiable when it comes to transferring jiu-jitsu to MMA. Gordon Ryan, who is considered the greatest no-gi grappler of all time, he had made it known that he was looking to transfer into MMA years ago. And the only reason he didn't was because his coach, John Danaher, who was also the MMA coach of George St. Pierre and Chris Weidman, he convinced Gordon not to do it. And the reasoning he used was...
So John doesn't want me to compete in MMA because he feels like jiu-jitsu is just about to break into that next level of professional sports.
That's horse shit. The reason why he did not want Gordon to go to MMA is because Gordon, he doesn't have super high-level wrestling. In recent years, it's gotten a little bit better, but it's still not even close to the standards of what it needs to be in MMA. And Gordon, he's just not super fast twitch. He's kind of slow. Of course, I don't know how many drug tests he can legitimately pass with his current steroid stack that he's on. And frankly, his jiu-jitsu, it just wouldn't work for MMA. Gordon's game, it's just so slow-paced and methodical, which works for him because he's such a technician. But in a sport like MMA where if you get stationary and you just stop moving underneath someone, you're going to get blasted in the face, it just doesn't work. Of course, most heavyweight divisions kind of suck, so I'm sure up to a certain extent, Gordon could have success. But like I said, when you're fighting the best of the best, that style, that is just not built for MMA. And circling back to Charles, I think that was precisely his problem and how he approached the fights against Islam Makhachev and Arman Tsarukyan, because you go back to when he fought Michael Chandler, who is an insanely high-level wrestler, and, during round one, he's a difficult fight for anybody because he's so explosive, so strong, and he goes so hard at you. And Charles shot a double leg on him that was so deep that Chandler said himself he had to jump guillotine because he was getting taken down, and Charles used that to take his back, sink the body triangle in. And, he worked to impose his grappling against a superior wrestler. But fast forward to Arman and Islam, and the only time he was engaging with them in any kind of grappling context was if he was the one getting taken down or he was working from full guard. And it's just not a reliable position if you need to impose your game onto your opponent. But again, I don't want to necessarily assert that Charles would have beat Islam with a tweak to his game plan, but he has advantages on the ground when it comes to pure submissions. But fighting from this position right here and choosing to stay here is completely neutering his game. And I think this gets proved by the fact that there was a moment in Charles' fight with Islam where he went to half guard and shot for a leg lock. And Islam stood up and ran away because Charles was moving into a position where he had an advantage. But then, again, immediately following that, he gets hit with a hip toss, grabs full guard, and stays there for the rest of the round. But again, when you look at modern jiu-jitsu today, these guys, they're such well-rounded grapplers that, it is the perfect base to transfer into MMA. One of the most hyped prospects who just came into MMA, he's fighting at 1FC, Cade Rotolo. The 77-kilogram ADCC champion, he's only 21 years old, and he had a grappling match over at 1 against a Sambo world champion. And I'm talking a real Sambo world champion, not quite like Khabib and Islam. Khabib and Islam are kind of the Andrew Tates of Sambo in terms of, what organization they were competing for. But Cade went against a real world champion, and he just put a fucking beating on this guy. Jumping for his back. Super explosive takedown attempts. At the end of the day, he heel hooked him. Inside heel hook. The guy had the tap. It's this style of grappling that I think jiu-jitsu at the highest level breeds that is so insanely overpowered in a context like MMA. And this may come as a surprise to some of you, but I think the number one guy who uses a skill set like this to the highest level is Islam Makhachev. Now, Islam Makhachev, he comes from kind of a judo, sambo background, like I said, but when you look at the ADCC skills that I'm describing, I really think he represents it well. He has amazing wrestling, of course, good throws, but also really, really good back takes and submissions. In his last fight against Dustin Poirier, he used a Kimura trap, to force Dustin to turn a specific way just so he could slide his hooks in. And the way he was able to catch that Darce in the 5th round through that transition. Now, of course, he's not nearly as high level with submissions as someone like Ortega or even Charles, but he comes from the Sambo background, and Sambo, as a rule set, is essentially wrestling, judo, and jiu-jitsu all in one, making him a well-rounded grappler, which I think is the exact same thing the ADCC rule set creates as well. So to me, where this all comes down to is you just cannot get stationary when you're grappling. It is just not a good idea. You see, jiu-jitsu as a foundational martial art, it's built for no time limit. So grabbing full guard works in that context because you have an unlimited amount of time to set your opponent up for something. But when you're dealing with 5-minute rounds in MMA, you do not have that luxury because the person on top is just going to more or less try to stalemate you and win the round purely from being on top. So you have to transition. You have to keep attacking. You can't just stop and relax in bottom position, which I think Charles did amazing against Kevin Lee. No matter what position he was in, he never stopped moving. It was just constant attacks. Even if the attack wasn't super deep, or maybe he wasn't going to quite ever finish him with it, he was making Kevin move and defend, and he was winning that fight from bottom position. But, you grab full guard and just hang out there, it's going to be a stalemate. It's not going to work. You have to transition. You have to move. You have to try to impose your grappling on your opponent, which I think that is what you need to do to transfer jiu-jitsu into MMA.